This lecture is going to look at the theory of forms and try to present it primarily in light of Diotima's account of the form beautiful in Plato's dialogue called the Symposium. In that dialogue, Socrates gives a speech about the nature of love, and he gives that speech as a discussion between him and this philosopher, Diotima, who had taught him about love years before. So I've got other videos on who Diotima is and on her theory of love that is presented in the Symposium. But in this lecture, I'm just going to focus in on the theory of forms, or how her speech gives us an account of the forms that can better help us understand what each form is. So she talks about the form beautiful, and that's used as sort of an example for all other forms, so that's what we'll focus on here throughout much of this lecture. So in Diotima's account, she discusses the form of the beautiful, or the form beauty, or beauty itself, or the beautiful itself. All those are different names for the same thing. And her discussion of that sheds some light on what a form is in general, and how forms in general differ from particular things. The reason for this is because the form beauty represents all forms, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's in this dialogue that we see a description of a form that is described such that it really would fit with any form. So the form beauty represents all forms. Why is this? On the Platonic view, especially as interpreted by, say, some of the Neoplatonists like Plotinus, beauty is the manifestation of a thing's order, or structure, or function. So whenever we perceive something as beautiful, we're seeing an order, structure, or a function in it. As I see that something is beautiful, that means I'm seeing a certain structure in it, a certain order in it, a certain function in it. At least that's the Platonic view as I interpret it. And note, this is a consequence of this view, and I think this is right. This means that everything will be beautiful in some way or from some perspective, since everything has some kind of structure to it, right? So the idea of beauty here, and in the Platonic tradition in general, is beauty actually applies to any individual thing from some perspective, and it's really only privations that would lack beauty completely. So a lack of something won't have beauty, but anything that is an actual thing will have some beauty from at least some perspective, or in some way. Because beauty just is the manifestation of structure, order, or function. So I'm not going to be able to defend this idea of beauty fully, right? And that's not exactly the point of this lecture anyway, but I do just want to give you some hints about why beauty is being thought of in this way that hopefully help clarify things, and then we'll get into Diotima's description of the form beautiful. So let's just consider some typical experiences that we humans have of beauty. So our biological drives make certain things appear beautiful and others not. So for example, a green field, that might look beautiful, whereas a mangled corpse doesn't. And I take it that has to do with our biological structure, right? A corpse is something, mangled corpse is like danger to be avoided, whereas a green field is like calm. And obviously beauty having to do with all kinds of other things. A lot of beauty that we perceive, not all beauty, but I'm just saying this is one kind of beauty that we perceive, does have to do with our biological drives and structures. And the idea here is things ordered to human flourishing on a biological level are going to tend to appear beautiful to us. We perceive them as structures that are ordered to maintaining our biological structure. So that's one way that, sort of one class of beautiful things that humans perceive. Now, of course, that's not the only class, so let's go on to other, what are sort of other kinds of beauty that humans perceive. So the practices you engage in, the habits you've developed. If you are into a certain kind of music, listen to it all the time, you might find that kind of music beautiful. Or if you get another kind of music that is similar to it, or where somehow it captures you in a certain way because you really sort of see what's operative there, the structure of it. If you think that a certain kind of behavior is good and you strive to engage in it, you might find that kind of behavior beautiful. Remember, beautiful in ancient Greek is used in a much wider sense than we typically use it in English. So anything is beautiful. We do have this wide sense where we might call a certain kind of action as noble and beautiful, or it's desirable in some way. Right, so these things that are really practices we engage in will make us perceive certain things as beautiful and other ones as not. Right, because this is where you start to get some disagreement. Right, if someone doesn't really ever listen to a certain kind of music, and maybe it's not relevant to different practices in their life, they'll think it's ugly, or they'll perceive it as ugly, but maybe you'll perceive it as beautiful. Same with kinds of behavior, right? Some kinds of behavior that you might perceive as good, someone else might perceive that as bad and ugly or shameful. But it has to do with what are the habits that you've developed in your life? What are the practices that you engage in on a regular basis? Because that's going to change the way you perceive things and what you perceive as beautiful and what you perceive as not beautiful. So in this case, it would be things ordered to the structure of the lifestyle we live, and the practices we engage in tend to appear as beautiful to us. We perceive those things as structures that are ordered to maintaining our lifestyle or our practices. And since humans, again, have different kinds of lifestyles and different kinds of practices, a lot of which are opposed to one another, that's on this level you are going to get much more disagreement between people about what they perceive as beautiful and what they don't perceive as beautiful. The laws, cultures, customs that have formed your way of life, right? These give you more kind of things that you'll perceive beautiful and maybe people from another culture wouldn't. Cultural perceptions. One culture might view certain kinds of body types as beautiful while other culture prefers other kinds of body types. Or moral perceptions. In our culture, rape appears as an ugly activity generally, right? We're repulsed by that. So things ordered to the structure of our culture and our way of life tend to appear as beautiful to us. We perceive those things as structures that are ordered to maintaining our culture and way of life. Right, so this is just meant to say, let's just think of some, and this is not exhaustive, right? We're just thinking of some ways in which things are going to appear beautiful to different people. And why is that? It's because the people perceive as a kind of structure that's ordered to maintaining the structure of their way of life, or maybe their biology, or maybe practices they engage in, and so on. And so those kind of considerations can sort of give us, again, this is not meant to be a full-on proof of this, but it at least gives us some ways of thinking about why people would think that the form beauty represents all forms, because it represents structure or some kind of order. And that's what we perceive when we see something as beautiful. We perceive like, oh, that structure or order, like I see that one. And it's relevant to the structure or order of my way of living, or of my biology, or of how I view the world, or of my culture, and so on. Right, so on this Platonic view, beauty is a manifestation of a thing's order, structure, or function, and the forms, since they are structures and ordering principles of all things, that's why beauty, the form beauty, is sort of a representative of all forms. Or to say it a different way, you could even say each form can be thought of as an instance of the form beauty, at least looking at it from a certain perspective. Because if beauty is structures being manifest and the forms are the structures of things, then each form is sort of an instance, a certain type of beauty, a certain type of structure. Now again, you don't have to agree with any of this to agree with the theory of forms, or to kind of agree with Diotima's main point. This is just trying to clarify some things so we can get at what Diotima is going to be saying about the forms. Since the form beauty here represents all forms, the way Diotima characterizes it applies to all forms. So how does she characterize it? What I'm going to do is, starting around, it would be those numbers in the margins, 211a, I'm going to go through what she says about the form of the beautiful, or the beautiful itself, what she says about that step by step. So let's start. She starts by saying, first, it, meaning the form of beauty, always is, and neither comes to be nor passes away. So what's being said here? How does this apply to all forms? The claim being made here would be that forms are the basis of atemporal or eternal truths. Every individual beautiful thing comes into being at a certain time and passes away at a certain time, but beauty itself always is. That's what she's claiming. And the idea here is this is why forms are atemporal and eternal, and they're the basis for atemporal and eternal truths. Let me give an individual example. I mean, we've talked about this in the introduction to forms, but an example would be individual Tyrannosaurus rexes. They come to be, they pass away. But the form Tyrannosaurus rex, which is what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex, always is, because it's always true, right? Or the truths that are connected to that form are always true, and so the form, as the basis of those truths, always is. So the form, what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex, that doesn't change, that doesn't come into being, that doesn't pass away, that just always is. It always is what it is. Right? What a Tyrannosaurus rex is always what a Tyrannosaurus rex is. The thing that comes to be and passes away, or the things that come to be and pass away, are the individual Tyrannosaurus rexes, not the form itself. And so same with the form beauty, same with all forms. Second claim she makes. She says, second, it is not beautiful in this way and ugly in that way, nor beautiful at one time and ugly at another, nor beautiful in relation to one thing and ugly in relation to another, as if it would be beautiful for some people and ugly for others. So what can we take away from this claim? All individual beautiful things are beautiful in some ways and ugly in others, so that's part of what we can take away. The claim here being made is if we're talking about any individual thing, whether a painting or a person or a landscape or whatever you want to talk about as beautiful, it's beautiful in some ways, but it's ugly in other ways. Or beautiful from some perspective, ugly from others, right? Or beautiful in relation or in comparison to some things, or ugly in comparison to others. And maybe it's going to be beautiful for some people and ugly for others. Right? So all these individual beautiful things are beautiful for some people and ugly for other people. They sometimes appear beautiful and they sometimes don't. So that's a claim about individual things we perceive around them. There's nothing in this world that we perceive and experience around us that's just pure beauty. It's always beautiful in one way, maybe ugly in another way. And the idea behind this is since beauty is structure, things are always going to have structure and order in one way and from one perspective, but then it'll be disordering or unstructured from another perspective, or in another way. And so that's the claim about individual things. But the form beautiful just is what it is to be beautiful, right? It's just beauty itself. It contains in itself all possible ways of being beautiful and perspectives. It contains in itself all possible perspectives on beauty. Thus, the beautiful itself is not ugly from any perspective or in any way. The form beautiful, it just is beauty, so it can't be ugly, right? It's what we perceive as beautiful in any individual thing. That's all already contained in the form beautiful. So the form beautiful as what it is to be beautiful, it isn't ugly in any way. Let me give another example. So that's using the form beautiful as our example form. Let me give a different kind of form, like the form of a dog, right? And see if the same thing would follow here. So individual things we call dogs are dogs from one perspective and in some ways, but not dogs from others. Well, wait, what? Here it's less clear perhaps, so what does this mean? So for example, in our everyday perspective we usually take on the world, there's the things we call dogs, we're usually perceiving them as dogs. But from another perspective, that we could take, right, they're a clump of cells, right? I could choose to view a dog instead of focusing on, hey, it's a dog and that's the species of animals, say, well, really it's just a clump of cells, or really it's just a bunch of atoms, right, this thing I'm perceiving in front of me. Now, sure, from our everyday perspective, we're focusing on the way in which it's a dog, but it's also, there's other possible ways of focusing on that thing in front of you that, is wagging its tail and so on. You could focus on it as a bunch of atoms or a clump of cells, and as in that sense as not a dog, right, as something less than a dog. So they're in one way dogs, right, these things that we perceive, right, the thing that I'm petting, that I see with my eyes. In one way that's a dog, certainly in the way I normally relate to it, it's a dog. But in other ways, you could think of it as dinner, right? To animals or to people who eat dogs, they might not perceive that as a dog. They might perceive it as dinner. Or maybe they'll perceive it as both, right? In terms of people who eat dogs, they perceive it as dog and as dinner. But I take it, think of another kind of animal that eats dogs, like wolves, I guess, or whatever. In that case, the wolf isn't thinking, oh, this is a dog. It's like what it's perceiving is this thing I'm going to eat. Right? Or maybe it's perceived as a best friend to some people, right? And so, again, sure, we're going to call these things dogs, and that's the normal way we're viewing them, but there are these other ways of taking up those entities in front of us, these other ways of viewing them. And so in that sense, from some perspectives, they're dogs, from other perspectives, they're not. But the form dog is what it is to be a dog, and is not a not dog in any sense. Now, someone could raise an objection to this claim, though, and say, isn't the form dog a not dog in the sense that it's a form and not an individual dog? And I would say, well, no, because each thing we call a dog is a dog only because the form dog is in it, or if you want to put it a different way, because it participates in the form dog. So when I'm using the word dog, what I'm really talking about is the form dog that's in this thing in front of me, or that this thing in front of me that I'm petting participates in. In other words, each dog is only a dog insofar as it is the form dog in which it shares. Now, I know these are a lot of technical terms and so on, and if this isn't, if this is making things more complicated, then you can let it go. If this is helpful for you, good. But the idea here is the form dog is just what it is to be a dog. It's not what it is to be a dog, right? It's just dogness. And so dogness is dogness, period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, or from this perspective or from that perspective. Dogness just is dogness. And the form dog just is the form dog, where any individual dog is a dog from some perspectives and is not from others. Diotima goes on then. So she says about the form beautiful, nor will the beautiful appear to him in the guise of a face or anything else that belongs to the body. Forms are not bodies or physical things. And so that's kind of the main claim being made here. The form beautiful is not a body or physical things, and no forms are. In other words, forms are not things that are located somewhere in space. For example, and we talked about this in the mini lecture introducing you to the theory of forms, but the form Tyrannosaurus rex, or what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex, isn't located anywhere, right? Individual Tyrannosaurus rexes are, but that form isn't anywhere, right? It's not like I'm going to, go into a forest and there the form of Tyrannosaurus rex is walking around. No, because the form of Tyrannosaurus rex is just this thing we can understand. We can't perceive it. We can only understand it with our mind, right? It's what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex, or T-Rexness. That isn't located anywhere. You're never going to find it walking around in the forest. You'll find individual things that share in that form. You would have found them if you were back, however many years ago before Tyrannosaurus rexes went extinct. But you won't ever find the form Tyrannosaurus rex anywhere because it's not a physical thing, it's not a body, it's not located in space. Then she goes on to say, it will not appear as one idea or one kind of knowledge. And so this is the claim that the form beautiful is not an idea, it's not a kind of knowledge, and that same goes for any form. A form is not a concept or an idea in the mind. Forms are not a kind of knowledge or a theory, right? Because what this theory is trying to talk about, what Diotima or Plato or Socrates, right, whoever you want to attribute this theory to, is trying to get you to see is that there's something beyond our concepts, something beyond our minds, something beyond the ideas, and that's what the forms are. Something beyond the sciences and kinds of knowledges that we have. A way to clarify this, perhaps, and again, I know this is fairly technical, but forms are what all ideas, theories, and kinds of knowledge are about. Right? So if I'm going to have a concept, I've got to have a concept about something. I've got to have an idea, it's got to be about something. If I'm going to have a theory, it has to be about something. And if I'm going to have kinds of, a certain kind of knowledge, like physics or whatever, it's got to be about something. And so the forms are what all of those are about. right? So I can have a concept of beauty, but that concept is actually a concept of or about the form beautiful. I can have a concept of Tyrannosaurus rex, but that concept is of or about the form Tyrannosaurus rex. That's the idea. So the form animal is what the science of zoology is about. Right? So zoology is the branch of science that studies kinds of animals, and so it's about the form animal. All theories and ideas about animals are really about this form animal on this Platonic view, and animals are just beings as they share, insofar as they share in the form animal. Right? So that's what animals are. They're beings considered insofar as they share in the form animal. And so really all our concepts aren't even about these individual beings directly, or about the forms in which all those individual beings share and what make those individuals what they are. That's how the theory of forms and Plato seem to want to view things. Then Diotima goes on to say, again, we're still talking about the beautiful itself, or the form beauty. It is not anywhere in another thing, as in an animal, or in earth, or in heaven, or in anything else, but itself by itself with itself. It is always one form, and all other beautiful things share in that, in such a way that when those others come to be or pass away, this does not become in the least bit smaller or greater, nor suffers any change. So what we can take away from here is the forms are not anywhere. So contra what you might read about the forms on the internet or in other books, because different people interpret Plato differently, and there's been this interpretation coming from, I don't know where actually, maybe from some comments Socrates makes in the Republic, that like forms, they exist in form heaven, or they exist in the mind of God, where we have an explicit claim here that forms don't exist anywhere. They're not in space. They're not spatial things. They aren't anywhere. They're not in a mind. They're not anywhere. Right? They're not in another thing. So Diotima is super explicit about this. So they're not anywhere on earth. They're not anywhere in heaven. And heaven is ambiguous in Greek, where that could be talking about they're not in, like, up with the stars. So we could say, they're not in outer space. Or it could be an otherworldly kind of heaven, like we might think of an afterlife kind of heaven. So I take it when she says heaven there, take it in both ways, right? Forms aren't in outer space. They're not in some other world heaven. Each form is itself by itself, and things in space and time share in them. So this is the precise way to talk about forms. Again, if we're speaking loosely, like I did earlier in this lecture, actually, I said, well, form could be thought of as in something. And Socrates is sometimes willing to grant, like, yeah, you could talk that way if you wanted. But I think with Diotima, we're getting more precise to say, well, strictly speaking, though, if we're going to say it's in something, we got to be really clear, because it's not in something as in one spatial object is in another thing. It's just better to think the forms aren't anywhere. That's at least the Platonic view. Each form is just itself by itself. It's this thing we can think about, we can comprehend, we can understand, and that's it, right? We can understand things, and what we understand doesn't have to be anywhere. What we perceive has to be somewhere, but what we understand doesn't have to be. And so all humans share in the form human nature, but the form human nature isn't anywhere, right? We're all humans, we're all sharing in that, but I'm never going to, again, I've used this example before, but I'm never going to walk around, hey, turn around, guess what's back in the corner? Human nature is. No, it's not how it works. I'm sharing in human nature, you are, but I'm never going to see that human nature itself anywhere. Right? I can understand it, but again, what we understand isn't located anywhere. That's at least the Platonic view. And so there's no form heaven where, when you die, you go up and you float around with the forms. Sometimes you'll see people characterizing Plato's view in that way. Here's where you can see that's not the view that comes forth in the dialogues. Sometimes you'll get an analogous language that makes it sound that way, like in some of the myths that Socrates tells. But remember, the myths are not the, rigorous, serious philosophy. The myths are important, but they're not telling us, what Plato's actual, rigorously defensible philosophical views are. Okay, so if we sum up these different characteristics Diotima identifies, then we can pull out 5. So first is forms are atemporal or eternal. Again, I talked about that in the previous mini lecture introducing the forms as well. Second, each form f, which f will just be a variable to represent any form, each form f is fully f. So, right, form beautiful is fully beautiful. Form tree is fully tree. Form human is fully human. And it's in no way not f, right? So, again, we can fill in f with any form. So, the form beautiful is in no way not beautiful. Form human is in no way not human. All individual things are only f in certain ways and from certain perspectives, right? So that's kind of the contrast that second point is drawing. The form is fully what it is, where individual things are only from certain perspectives. Now this claim, the second claim about the forms, does actually have some nuance to it, because there's certain senses, depending on what we mean by not, where there's sentences where we would say, you know, this form, the form beautiful is not this, that, or the other, is not beautiful in some sense, perhaps. Plato deals with those kind of negative statements about the forms in his dialogue called The Sophist, and you do have to sort of make it more sophisticated. So this claim is right, but it does require more clarification. If we went fully trying to figure out every objection we could raise to it, the second point here about each form is fully f and in no way not f would actually require some clarification. You could show, yeah, that's actually right in the end, but it does need some more nuance than we get here. Forms are not bodies or physical things. Again, I take it this is relatively straightforward. Right? They're not, I don't see forms walking around. Forms are things we understand. They're not things we perceive. We perceive bodies. We can perceive physical things, but we can't perceive forms with our senses, right? We can perceive it with the mind by understanding it. Forms are not ideas, concepts, theories, or kinds of knowledge, right? Because ideas, concepts, theories, and kinds of knowledge are of forms or about forms, right? We have a concept of a form. I have an idea about a form. I have theories about forms. I have kinds of knowledge about forms. But yeah, the forms themselves are the basis of the ideas, the concepts, the theories, the kinds of knowledge that we get. And then the forms are not anywhere, right? So let's just be rigorous, not try to, imagine what a form is like. When you can't imagine one, you can only understand it. And the idea is, if we're talking about something that isn't located anywhere in space, that I can't perceive, it's not a body, then why don't we just be rigorous and say forms aren't anywhere? They're just not the kind of thing that's somewhere, right? They're not a spatially located thing. That doesn't mean they're not real. That doesn't mean they're not something we can talk about and which we can conceptualize. We can conceptualize them. We can talk about them. So they are, right? In that sense, they are or exist, but they're not things in the world or in the universe or on Earth or in some other world even, because they're not anywhere. They're not things that are located somewhere. Okay, so that's the basic view of forms that Diotima gives you. Now, let's move on to kind of where it would go from here. I mean, we're not going to go here in this class because, this would take more than a semester to do, but there are objections and clarifications on what forms are, and some of Plato's late or more advanced dialogues pose and address objections to the theory of forms. The theory of forms even as I've just presented it. And so we have dialogues like Plato's Parmenides, where that dialogue starts with the philosopher Parmenides talking to Socrates when Socrates was a young man, and Socrates is presenting the theory of forms. And Parmenides presents these objections to the theory of forms that refute the version of it, at least, that Socrates was given. And then Parmenides says, well, we shouldn't reject the idea of forms because these are necessary to make sense of anything. But your theory, like you're saying it right now, Socrates, when Socrates is young, it doesn't hold up. And then Parmenides says, you need to practice. And then the rest of the dialogue is super hard to read and is pretty strange, although scholars have made sense of what's going on there. And it's really addressing those objections posed at the beginning and showing precisely what it means to make these claims, like to say that forms always are, or that forms are one, right? Like, what does that actually mean? So Plato's Parmenides raises those objections to the theory of forms, and then provides the tools for us who read it to come up with a solution to the objections. Plato's Sophist also does this, so there's argument in the Sophist against what are called the friends of the forms. So these are people who support the theory of forms. They get attacked, a specific position they hold gets attacked in the Sophist, and then revised. So again, forms aren't rejected in the Sophist, but this one particular claim about them is rejected, and this one sort of conception that people or misunderstanding people might have of the forms and their changelessness is modified. And so we get, in the end, right, the Sophist gives us a much more sophisticated understanding of what a form is. In Plato's Statesman, that continues. We get even more sophisticated understandings of what forms are. In the Philebus, we get a sophisticated understanding of the forms and how they relate to ethical questions or questions of pleasure and experience. So what I'm giving you here is kind of the standard basic idea of the theory of form. These more advanced theories and these dialogues are super difficult to read. I'm just letting you know those are out there. Okay, so before I end, just one objection I get when I teach this often in a live classroom, one sort of question or objection students raise against the theory of forms is, what about evolution? What about gradation, right? So according to evolutionary theory, species evolve into one another, and there's therefore a gradation between species, right? So what about a liger, right? You might say, well, there's a form of lion and a form of tiger. Well, what about things that are in between that, right? Like a liger. And you go, oh, well, there's a form of liger. But if we're talking evolution, there's all kinds of gradations between different species of animals. And so does that mean there's a form for every single gradation, or what's going on here, right? Can the theory of forms even handle something like how the theory of evolution conceptualizes reality in animal species? Right, that's the question you might have. Can the theory of forms handle this kind of incremental change and incremental development and gradation that seems to be required by the theory of evolution? So, not surprisingly, I think it can, because I'm a big advocate of the theory of forms. And so I'm going to suggest a way that we can kind of get at how it can. This comes from these more sophisticated discussions of the theory of forms in the more advanced dialogues. So the basic structure of what I'm going to lay out here in the next couple of slides is based on Mitch Miller's, so there's a Plato scholar who's alive today. It's his work on Plato's Philebus, Statesman, and the unwritten teachings of Plato. So his work on that sort of shows this more sophisticated understanding of the theory of forms that's at play in some of these more advanced dialogues like the Philebus and the Statesman, and then the so-called unwritten teachings that Aristotle tells us about. So in order to keep things super simple, I'm going to just talk about the form cats. So cats are felines, like the family of animals, right? So the whole cat family, would include lions, tigers, house cats. So let's take that form. That's like a big form. It includes a lot of different individual kinds of species within it. But let's start there. So if we start with that one form, and we could start right with any other, you could do all animals. That'd just be way more complicated. So I'm going to just try to keep things simple and with cats. What you can do with a form is you start with it, and then we can set out what's called a dyad or continuum, right? This line that you see there on the screen now. And you could do this line in different ways. I'm going to choose this kind of arbitrary thing of let's look at smaller mature size versus larger mature size. So I'm going to sort of order all the species in the cat family and everything in the cat family in terms of the larger mature size or the smaller mature size. Now, this is not super scientifically helpful or anything. I'm not claiming it is. And you don't have to do size, right? You could do any kind of two terms that you could compare these different species of cats with would be fine. But the point here and what this is going to bring out is that what that line represents is the infinite possible individual mature felines. Right, so, there's an infinite number of points in any line segment. And so that's what we've got going on here. So all possible cats, all possible felines would be in that line somewhere, ordered in terms of mature size of their species. Then we can add in species forms. So these are smaller level forms that are underneath that bigger form of cats. We can divide that form up into these smaller, what we would call in zoology, species, right? So we can talk about a house cat, a bobcat, cheetah, cougar, African lion, Siberian tiger, saber-toothed tiger, right? We don't have to be species that have already gone extinct. And really what would be included here is all possible species. I've just selected a few just to try to keep this simple. And so what the species forms here designate are ranges on this continuum, right? It's not like if you go a little bit outside of, this particular size, you're no longer a house cat. No, there's a range. And then it's a continuum, so between a house cat and a bobcat, there's going to be other possibilities that individual cats could fill, where they're kind of between a house cat and a bobcat. And there can be overlap too, like you see the Siberian and saber-toothed tiger there. There's overlap in their mature size because they're pretty closely, there's probably more overlap than is really represented in this graph actually, because they were pretty close to the same size. And so that's fine. There can be overlap, and it's really a continuum, right? So there's plenty of gradations. Forms pick out species, sort of these stable characteristics of, or these species forms, what they would pick out is stable characteristics of a whole population, right? Not necessarily of each individual within that population. And so for individual things, there's all kinds of gradations, all kinds of mutations are possible, all kinds of ways where, they're kind of like the house cat, and they're kind of like a bobcat, so really they should go somewhere on that line in between those two. And all that's possible, right? So this is just trying to show the flexibility and the kind of possibilities that are implicit in the theory of forms. It's not like some rigorous, there has to be one form for each thing and no ambiguity there. Things can sort of kind of share in house cat and kind of share in bobcat, really perhaps share in neither fully. That's totally fine. The theory of forms is very flexible with this. And this idea of the indefinite dyad or of this continuum in some of those later or more advanced dialogues of Plato really brings that out and allows us to see that given all the different particular things we find in the world, that's fine, right? There can be a bunch of particularities that don't neatly fit into certain categories. That's totally all part of the system, right? There'll still be cats. They might not fit into any of these species. There might be some cats that don't fit into any of these species ranges perfectly, but that's fine because these species ranges are really just ranges. And they're ranges of characteristics that a whole population of the beings within that species could be in. So anyway, this is not meant to be exhaustive, this is not meant to be scientifically enlightening, and this is not meant to be, this graph is definitely not to scale. But this is just to give you a general idea of how something like the theory of forms can support evolution, can be a metaphysical basis that works with the theory of evolution or with other theories as well, right? The theory of evolution was definitely not around in Plato's time, and that's not how people would have thought of things. But the theory of forms is general enough, and it's working at a deep enough level where these other scientific theories can come and go, and the theory of forms is generally flexible enough to be able to handle them, because there's different ways of sort of seeing how forms work. And it's a really sort of complicated theory in Plato's more advanced dialogues.